They're not giving me food though. If not give me food, if I'm responsible.
That's what yes, you come and catch your tea.
Yeah. I thought if I sent him to okay, someone told me online.
Like, is that not to come and stay or you come and help you? You know, they assist. You get it.
Thank
But
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Good morning, everyone. So we are welcome to today's part of the panel session. We are supposed to have 5 paper presentations this morning in this part of the session. So we are looking forward to Sosthenes, Doris, Lucy, Sadiq, and Kenata. Like we did the last time, we'll be having for each presenter 10 minutes. At the 8 minutes, 8 minutes into your presentation, we would have a hand raise. You will see a hand raise by me as a reminder that you just have 2 minutes to go. At the end of which we will have to interrupt you if you have not been able to conclude so that we can beat the limited time we have. So 10 minutes for presentation, and after the presentations, we will now use the remaining time for questions and answers. I want to hear if you have anything to say before we start in earnest.
Well, welcome once again, all the participants. I don't think we have all our participants here present, but I hope that as we proceed, we will have some of them joining us. You are all welcome to this session.
Thank you. So we are starting with Sustenance. Okay. His paper is titled Suicide, Mourning, and the Dialectics of Subjectivity in Onyinwa Bineli's Someday Maybe. So Sustenance Eke is a PhD student in the Department of English and Film Studies, University of Alberta. He has taught English and Literary Studies at the University of Nigeria and Nsukka, and the use of English at Godfrey Okoye University and Bibegard Memorial Seminary, both in Enugu, Nigeria. He is a literary critic and a creative writer with poems, short stories, and research papers published in local and international journals. His research centers, among others, on depression and suicidality in Nigeria, decoloniality, environmental justice, and the intersection of postcolonialism, psychoanalysis, and cultural sociology, and the articulation of postcolonial subjectivity. You are welcome, Sustenance.
Thank you very much. As he has mentioned, the title of my paper is Suicide, Mourning, and the Dialectics of Subjectivity in Onyinwa Bineli's Someday Maybe. I don't know if you can hear me clearly.
Sure, please, go ahead.
Okay, all right, thank you. So the background, how we grieve a death reflects our relationship with the deceased and the nature of our subjectivity. This suggests that barring other variables, different individuals grieve differently, and their modes of grief are legitimate within the sociocultural context of their expression. However, some ways of grieving strain the common receptacle into which griefs flow in a given culture, in much the same way as some deaths challenge the culturally sanctioned practices of mourning. Onyinwa Bineli's Someday Maybe thrives on this double inscription, which he leaves on the cultural paradigms of dying and mourning due to the suicidal death of a husband and the complicated grief of his wife. Published in 2022, this diasporic African novel projects a protagonist grappling with grief in the aftermath of her husband's suicide. Although it has yet to receive scholarship beyond its book reviews, this novel nuances through the protracted grief complex of the protagonist, the cultural practices of mourning, while raising the question of the relationship between grieving the dead and the dialectical formation of the subject. My focus engages with the relationship between mourning a suicide death and the construction of subjectivity in Someday Maybe. It attempts to understand how grieving a suicide loss reshapes the subject's relationship with the self and the other. and the textual connection the novel makes between mourning the dead and the construction of subjectivity. To do this, I examine the character of Eve, the deceased wife, whose grief consumed the impulse of the narrative, paying attention to how her subjectivity jolts and dilates in order to accommodate her emergent reality. The argument, with insight drawn from psychoanalysis, particularly from Sigmund Freud's work on mourning and Jacques Lacan's articulation of subjectivity, I argue that suicide mourning, besides training the accepted cultural mode of grief expression, operates dialectically by dismantling and reconstituting the subject in a space where absence has become the locus of meaning. Theoretical positions. In his essay, Mourning and Melancholia, Freud theorizes the subjective experience of mourning and melancholia, both of which follow from the event of loss. Distinguishing between the two, mourning is understood as non-pathological response to a lost object. Hence, it is considered heady grief, while melancholia is seen as a pathological response to object loss, which is often unconscious. Freud goes further to observe that the presence of the conflict of ambivalence in normal mourning, that is, the coexistence of love and hate towards the object of love, transforms it into pathological mourning, thereby bringing it on equal level with melancholy. The blurring of this distinction paves the way for the interrogation of human subjectivity through the experience of mourning and melancholia. According to Freud, the emotion of pathological mourning, I quote, gives us insight into the constitution of the human ego, for in it we see how one part of the ego presents itself to the other, critically assesses it, and so to speak, takes it as its object. End of quote. This splitting of the ego, or the subject, as Lacan would prefer it, signals the lack that is constitutive of human subjectivity. With Lacan, mourning becomes not just emotional suffering, but the structural condition of subjectivity. The event of loss discloses the void in the symbolic order, exposing the subject's incompleteness. The work of mourning, therefore, serves, I quote, as a palliative for the chaos that ensues, owing to the inability of all the signifying elements to deal with the whole in existence that has been created by someone's death. End of quote. With the entire signifying system destabilized by bereavement, the subject is forced to negotiate new terms of relationship with the symbolic order. This experience sets off a dialectical interplay between the subject's sense of stability and the discovery of the absence that structures their design. In this regard, while subjectivity understands the lived experience of a subject, the dialectic of subjectivity focuses on the tension between the self and the other, the contradiction that is both internal and external in the subject's relationship with the symbolic order. Interrogating Eve's experience in the novel dialectically means that I'm as much interested in the simultaneous collapse of her subjectivity following the husband's death as in its gradual reconstruction with the flashes of insight it brings to the understanding of how we are refashioned by grief. Analysis. Someday maybe may be read as a discourse on grief, given the in-depth analysis the novel provides on the recesses of a subject in confrontation with the reality of death. With the sequence inaugurated by suicide, we are introduced to unbearable grief which impoverishes subjectivity, leaving Eve a wreck of herself. As we read from her, I quote, "I look and feel like I have been turned inside out. The person I was no longer exists," end of quote. No doubt Quentin was her love object and functioned as her fantasy of wholeness while alive. In Lacanian terms, Quentin is her objet art, the elusive object cause of desire that appears to give her life meaning and coherence. His suicide, therefore, shatters this illusion and confronts her with the void at the center of her subjectivity. According to her, I quote, "Kill's death has exposed the tenuity of the control I have over my life," end of quote. But this is also a death that reveals the fragility of her subjective construction, annihilating the structure of selfhood she has built within the 10 years of their marriage. Scholars have noted that suicidal grief. Suicidal death elicit grief different from other modes of death. John Jordan, for instance, identified the thematic aspect of suicide bereavement, such as guilt, blame, loss of meaning, abandonment, and so on, which he argued differentiate it from grief associated with other modes of death. With the guilt and existential despair that follows from suicide, it can therefore be argued that suicidal death leaves a radical destructuring of subjectivity. If journey through the aftermath of her husband's suicide is in this light seen to unfold a structure of subjectivity, foiled through opposing personal and cultural forces. As a British Nigerian woman, her subjectivity is formed at the intersection of two cultural frameworks, Western individualism and Nigerian collectivism. Her grief is rendered hyper-visible in her Nigerian family environment, which encourages stoicism, invoking cultural resistance, but illegible at her white-dominated workplace, which recommends open emotional expression to profit from her pain. At the personal level, she is a woman whose interior world has been a site of endless struggle, as she oscillates between the painful dynamic of Quentin's presence and absence, between a desire to let go and a compulsion to hold on, forever suspended between memory and reality. Her subjectivity is in this way caught up in a liminal space haunted by past and present, both of which are in a dialectical interaction. This temporal dialectics demands a new mode of reckoning with subjectivity, unraveling a historicity that is marked by tension and contradiction, which are, however, interwoven with the diachronic involvement of the subject. In conclusion, the very foundation of Eve's subjectivity is destabilized by Quentin's death, and what follows cannot be considered a simple return to wholeness, but a dialectical process of disintegration and partial reconstruction. In her words, I quote, "When grief shatters you and leaves you to try and put yourself back together again, it can be no surprise that some parts are accidentally omitted." The paper thus concludes that suicide grief subverts and reconfigures the constitution of the grieving subject, while problematizing the cultural ethos of mourning the dead. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for such a wonderful presentation and for keeping to time. So we move on to the paper by Doris Ike. Her paper is titled The Aesthetic of Grieving, Thinking, Being, Dying, Existing, an exegetical reading of Mariam Abbas' So Long a Letter and the Gospel of John 11:33 to 35.
I don't think I will have her bio here. Maybe she can just introduce herself briefly while
Okay,
she proceeds with the
Doris,
presentation.
please, you first introduce yourself in the interest of those who may want to collaborate with you. They may need to know your interests.
Okay. Good morning, everyone.
Money.
We can hear
Hello?
you.
We can
Yeah,
hear
we
you.
can hear
Go
you.
ahead.
Okay. Sister Doris and Ike, a lecturer in Eucharistic part of health technology over in Osaka. And the title of my paper is Aesthetic Grieving, Thinking, Being, Dying, and Existing. I'm taking exegetical reading of Maria Abbas' So Long a Letter and the Gospel of John 11:33 to 35. My focus in this reading is to go into the meaning of grieving by understanding the concept of grieving. But before thinking about the concept of grieving, the paper stands to say that grieving is highly associated with the loss of the bodily matter. And on the other hand, this loss is the very essence of human existence, because death is a prior condition that awaits all mortals. But the discourse we engage in this work is how language of grieving transverses our understanding of absence of the physical loss of the body, to inquire more on the phenomenology of being, where death, as we say, becomes a color that reminds every being about how to be in its authentic mood. Actually, the idea of grieving discloses certain truth about natural human response to tragic emotions of suffering, angst, pains, and loss that constantly stirs human design at the face. The word design is a Heideggerian word that suggests being. In other words, anything that exists, being there in complex web of relation. And this idea of being involves that we do not exist alone. And because we do not exist alone, we share our being with other beings in the world. It could be friends, it could be objects, it could be anything. So when that comes, there is a kind of disentanglement. There is a kind of a separation. There is a kind of non-involvement of being. And this non-involvement, disintegration, there are the certain existential categories that necessitate the moment of grief. Then the paper goes further to argue that grieving has certain aesthetic implication. Judging from the point of view that when one grieves, we put into consideration not just the essence of loss, but certain categories that deals with remembering, solicitude, fear, and care. The paper uses Ricoeur's idea of grieving when he poses that grieving is a tale of an emotional struggle in differential mode and categories. Ricoeur, on his idea of grieving, argues that the narrative of loss is not just something that talks about the individual person who is grieving, but a way of reliving the lost body by bringing into the present the shares of past experiences that connect the living with the dead. Going further, the focus which this paper would like to tread is to take back to the Western moment in the history of Western philosophy, how our ancient philosophers view grieving. And we draw from Aristotle's Phaedo, where we encounter the death of Socrates, and we see Socrates romanticizing human anticipation of death as a gift that liberates the body, the soul from the body, by offering the soul a better afterlife in the company of men and wisdom. During his life on earth, we know that Socrates is the father of Western philosophy, and we know how he died by poison. But then the people who were there with him were recounting his experience, and for them, they did not perceive in the dying man any sense of remorse, any sense of anger. They perceived in him somebody who is anticipating for a life after in the company of the gods and men of wisdom. It will take us back to the former saying, the former argument of the paper that grieving and dying is a channel that paves way for a better life after. Then Socrates equally argues that there are certain elements in grieving that elicits in the mourner a pleasure that brings the past into the present. This pleasure deals with the idea of remembering. And according to him, this pleasure is even in mourning and lamentation for the departed. I quote, "There is grief indeed at his loss, but pleasure in remembering him, and as it were, seeing him before us in the deeds and in his life." These Greek writers, for them, grieving has aesthetic mode in the fact that it relieves the lost body in the present. Derrida equally, in his work, The Gift of Death, poses grieving as an activity that discloses the possibility of the impossibility of death. His idea is that the actual experience of death, that is grieving, which Socrates in Republic cautions, should not frighten men, but bring about higher value and cosmic significance of the sacrifice of that existence. In other words, just going back to remembering, that bringing past shared values into present, which the mourner possesses, becomes for any grieving soul at heels of glory to the man who grieves. And for the paper thinks that Derrida is right in his observation that one, under the tragic emotions of loss, experiences a new energy in which the energy turns into a performative and expressive acts of remembering and sublimation. The idea of sublimation breaks into the concept of aesthetic grieving a new identity, a new self, where the mourner or the person grieving realizes a new sense of direction in life. In other words, the paper poses this very context as a context of coping with grief. In other words, grieving is no longer seen as something that is abnormal, but something that could result to a productive experience that shares a new beginning to the individual. The argument the paper presents is that grieving uses language to bring being into the opening. Considering how human language opens up spaces of past memories, not only of pleasant things, but even the bad and ugly. In other words, whatever is noble, whatever is good, whatever is bad, could be ennobling in character, depending on the perspective one approaches it. Coming to the text, Bar so long a letter questions the human existence in the face of Islamic religion with its harsh cultural.
Sister, sorry, your time is up. Could you just conclude, please?
Hello?
Yes, sister. I said your time is up. Maybe you
Okay.
just make your final, your concluding statement.
Okay. In conclusion, the text under study, considering the character, the Roman Tulea, who is the heroine of the text, her idea of grieving is not just about the past, the death of her husband, but the cultural circumstances that surround her existence. She did not see the death of her husband, even though she grieves the death of the husband, but the experiences and shared lives she had with the husband helped her to construct a new identity in which grieving has certain aesthetic pleasurables. In John 11:35, Jesus wept at the death of Lazarus, which people misunderstood to be his relationship with Mary. But Jesus' idea of weeping brings back to the idea of death, that death is not the end, the terminal end of mortals, but a beginning that brings about a sense of authentic existence. That brings us also to what Heidegger reminds us about being towards death. In other words, the human finitude should be the focus of any existing mortals in order to
Thank
avert
you. Thank you.
the tragic emotions that bring about. Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So our next presenter is Lucy Chinyaka Iwuana. Their paper is Death and Mourning in Africa, Exploring Cultural Practices and Responses in Achebe's Things Fall Apart and Adichie's Half of a Yellow Sun.
Yeah, Lucy Chanyika Iwala is graduate of English and Literary Studies, University of Nigeria, Nsukka. She is a Wikimedian and is committed to indigenous language advocacy and has been taking part in language revitalization projects and conferences. She currently explores the critical literary phase on topics such as transnationalism. Yeah, Lucy, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much. The title of my paper is Death and the Mourning in Africa, Exploring Cultural Practices and Responses in Achebe's Things Fall Apart and Adichie's Half of a Yellow Sun. This paper will examine Achebe and Adichie's depiction of death and mourning responses and also transformation in African societies, from the sacred rituals to sites of violence. It also interrogates mourning as both cultural preservation and insurgent testimony. And finally, it will query the cultural responses of mourning to death that falls outside the confines of the natural order and how it shake and upturn the sanctity of the African cultural mourning practices. Death and mourning are universal human experiences, yet their meanings and response practices vary across cultures and nations. In the African cultural practice, death is not just a biological cessation, but a culturally constructed phenomenon that reflects societal values, beliefs, and also identity. It goes beyond the absence of physicalness. It is a symbol of identity and representation. However, the recent death occurrence in contemporary African society raises concerns among scholars as it bears an unnameable dilemma of responses for mourning and grieving the dead. By querying the cultural notion of mourning and grieving for the deceased, whose demise are unascertained, and seeking clarity on these new modalities of death, this research work will be guided by the question of how can a culture mourn when death is stripped of its sanctity, and when the body is stolen, and also when the grave is unmarked. In response, this discourse interrogates three modalities of death: the assumed death, the extrajudicial death, and natural death, and how its connection in the reimagining of mourning through a literary resistance. Modalities of death in the African society and literature. The ambiguity of death in African literature exposes a profound epistemic crisis where assumed, extrajudicial, and natural death destabilizes traditional mourning practices and also challenge cultural resilience and norms. Bioli considers death as a very negative concept and as such very difficult for some people to accept, and in such instances calls for diversity in mourning responses. While Owino is of the opinion that Africa's participation and experience in the First World War, led to many African families adopting Western mourning practices related to grieving, burying, and remembering the dead. So that is to say that this novel occurrence of death forces into existence novel trajectories of African mourning practices. For instance, in assumed death, like Kainene's disappearance in Adichie's Half of a Yellow Sun, there is a destabilizing of the systemic Igbo equal ritual, which forces mourners to regress into the shadow of uncertainty. Same is also in the case of extrajudicial killings, as in that of the woman cradling her child's severed head. There is an entire defilement in the mourning ritualization. Even natural death, such as Ezudu's ceremonious funeral or Ugu's mother's quiet passing as a result of coughing, become absurd sites of cultural preservation and indictment. Their traditional sanctity highlight the erasure of unmournable war victims. So we say that is to say that in Achebe and Adichie's narrative, both these texts of two eras, because Achebe is a somewhat of a pre-colonial text, and Adichie's is that of a contemporary, or you can also say a post-colonial text, reviews mourning as a contested space where conversation confronts the collapse of ancestral ontologies of violence. So in these three deathscapes, that is the assumed death, the judicial death, and the natural death, this research will reveal how African mourning practices, once cohesive, now revolves between remembrance and actual, and also revolves between the ancestral and the unimaginable. The assumed death, which is the first trajectory we'll be looking at. Assumed death constitutes a profound epistemic crisis. It goes on to disintegrate the existing framework that have long governed rituals of bereavement in the African community or society. The figure of Kainene in Adichie's Half of a Yellow Sun. Her fading status, which disappears during the war, during the mock Brown War, exemplifies the terror of absenteeism without evidence. Kainene went into kind of disappeared, a kind of a ghostly taking off leave from the world of the test. Her death was unaccountable. Nobody in the test, it wasn't ascertained if she actually died or she was just missing. And also, without this bodily evidence to confirm death, such disappearances is assumed to be death. And this is somehow, questions and tackles the existing modus operandi in the African mourning system, where in a funeral or in a death of at the death of a loved one, the body is physically present and is addressed and also buried. But in the case of Kainene, the death was not even ascertained because there was nobody and there was no information and there was no conclusion to whether Kainene actually died or she was missing. And these are the things that, these are the elements that kind of questions the existing and the once cohesive African responses and tradition in terms of death and mourning. Then the next one, another trajectory of mourning and death that we'll be looking at is the limits of ritual in extrajudicial death and the boundaries of cultural resilience. So extrajudicial death, which we say that is a death that defies the very logic of natural order, also challenges the African mourning practices. Now, for instance, the image of the woman cradling her child's severed head in Adichie's Half of a Yellow Sun. In this vivid image that was described in the text, we see a woman on the train who exists in what some scholars term the anti-ritual space, where death is so grotesque, a child's decapitation. Now you have now you have a child's head that is being carried in a basket. And it was so public that even in the train, that nobody was, in as much as it was a public misnomer, nobody could react due to the fear of what is happening outside. And that is what marks the possibility of the dignified mourning and exists outside the cultural script of the African mourning practices. Now, in the aspect of the extrajudicial death of Ikemefuna, which was also ordered by Oracle but executed with such brutality by Okonkwo, the boy's final word, according to the text, "My father, they have killed me," and Ezudu's warning, "That boy calls you father. Do not bear a hand in his hand," lingers as an unexorcised ghost in the machine of custom, and it limits and it reveals the limits of ritual to sanitize communal violence. Now, the last, which is natural death, which stand as a fragile island of cultural continuity amidst the torrential seas of extrajudicial death and assumed death, which is the death of Ezudu and also that of Olu's mother as a result of coughing. So we see that Ezudu's funeral, with its meticulous rendition, becomes an archival of performance showcasing Igbo cosmology, which is and its capacity to transform biological cessation into ancestral becoming. Now, in conclusion, this paper, by engaging these two texts, it kind of compel us to reconcile mourning not as a passive tradition, but as a dynamic practice, where the natural death of Ezudu and Ogu's mother, which was once cultural certainties, the African perspective of death, now functions as a mirror of rupture and reflects all the dead that can no longer follow their scripts, just in the case of the woman with her daughter's head, decapitated head, and that of Kainene's disappearance. In this light, Achebe and Adichie's work achieve literature's highest ethical function: to bury the unburied, to mourn the unmourned, and in doing so, to reclaim from the jaws of oblivion. So by giving voice to grief that defy ritual containment, they affirm that even in the shadow of annihilation, mourning remains an act of cultural survival. And African mourning practice have always absorbed historical shock, but never without a cost. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lucy. Thank you. You took a minute from us, but that's fine for your beautiful presentation. Our next paper is by Sadiq Abubakar Mohammed. Their paper is titled "Death as Exile: Locating Extraordinary Metaphors in Sadiq Zukogi's Your Crib, My Qibla." Is he in the physical audience, Sadiq? Is Sadiq in the physical audience?
Yeah, I'm here.
Yes, he is. Yeah, Sadiq Abubakar Mohammed is a graduate student at the Department of English, University of Ibadan, where he majors in literature. He is also a researcher and a poet. His research interests include trauma studies, bioethics, literature, and medicine. He is currently researching illness and trauma in cancer memoirs for his MA dissertation. Some of his publications have appeared in Cambridge Scholars Publishing, a journal of teacher education, among others. Sadiq, you have the floor.
Good morning, everyone. I'll be talking on death as exile, locating nostalgic metaphors in Sadiq Zukogi's Your Crib, My Qibla. Death is a natural process in which every living thing must pass through. It is a necessary end and will come whenever it will come, according to Shakespeare. The concept of dying in the African context has different meaning and interpretation. For instance, an each person who died might be said to have passed to glory. In contrast, a child or young adult who dies might be described to have gone so soon. While both the death of the aged and the young are unpredictable experiences, the death of the latter is said to be more grievous than the former due to the age factor. Death in the African context, unlike in the Western perspective, connotes a journey, that is a journey into the other world, which could mean a spiritual journey. This morbid mobility in the context of this study is read as a diasporic experience in which the term exile belongs to. In other words, exile here is treated as a dispersal of loved ones into another world, particularly the world of the dead. In understanding the peculiar experiences of those who are left behind, who have their loved ones dispersed into the other lands, Chenayon coins the term nostalgia. And nostalgia, as he described, is about the suffering of those who are left behind as a result of their loved ones dispersed to the other lands. Apart from that, it also includes the creativity in which this feeling spurs in them. In other words, nostalgia opens another layer of discourse from the perspective of those who are left behind, that is the bereaved. It interrogates the experiences of the bereaved and how these experiences spur the creative impulse in them. In this study, nostalgic metaphors are used are those metaphors that expresses the grief of the left behind and how those metaphors capture their experiences. While exilic experience in African poetry has received critical attention, scholarship is yet to engage with the metaphors with which the left behind express their grief, that is, those who are the stay-at-homes, who their loved ones have gone to the other world. This study addresses this gap by investigating the metaphoric language used to express nostalgia, the complex emotions of grief, trauma, and longing experienced in the wake of loss, using a poetry collection titled Your Crib, My Qibla by Sadiq Zukogi. The poetry is centered around the death of the poet's child, a girl who died around the age of 2. I used interpretative research design, and I also used a qualitative approach in engaging the text. Your Crib, My Qibla, which is a poetry collection under study, centers around the poet's child and the poems that express the feelings of the left behind. Those who are considered as the left behind in this, in the case of the collection, includes the father, who is the poet, the mother, and the extended relatives. From the title, one could see the use of a nostalgic metaphor, which is an instance of those metaphors that express the grief of the left behind. For instance, the poem is titled "Your Crib, My Qibla," and your crib symbolizes the deathbed of the child, while my Qibla indicates it's a Muslim term that means that talks about where the Muslims face to pray. So from that title, we could see the use of a nostalgic metaphor. That is, the poet is trying to say that the deathbed of the child would forever become where he would face to pray. There are different instances where nostalgic metaphors are used. In the poem Wine Glass, the nostalgic metaphor can be seen, where the poet says, if he had known the sky would inhale you out of him so quickly, he would have stayed with your toes forever. This statement shows how unwilling the persona is, to let go of the daughter into exile. That is, the exilic journey of the daughter is one that there is no hope for return. So, if he had known, he used that metaphor to say that if he had known that the child would have gone so soon, he would have stayed with the child forever, which is impossible. He just uses that metaphor to express how deep the pain, how deep the grief is. In another instance, he says, he didn't, every night is a night of grieving where light and darkness seem to shade each other. A stretch of sorrow sucks the color out of everything. The metaphor conveys the overwhelming grief and emotional pain of the parent who didn't get to say goodbye to the child. And also, we could see another instance where the poet says, today Baha is not dead, she's 6 years old, forcing marshmallows into his mouth. We could see this statement or this metaphor used recurrently in the poem. The use of that repetition in the poem just tries to tell us that grief is a continuous thing, and it is something that there is no, sometimes time might not necessarily heal the bereaved completely, but time would surely comfort them. Another instance where we could find a static metaphor is in the poem Umi, where one hears the daughter comforting the mother in the moment of grief. For instance, the line, "I know you often blame yourself, nor inside anything you feed me, but death wasn't in your breast milk. You wonder if God hears your voice." In this instance now, the poet brings the child alive in the poetry. He uses, we hear the dead speaking for herself, speaking about how the parents are not responsible for their for her predicament. Rather, it is just life that happened to her. In another instance, we could see the use of a tragic metaphor where the poet says, or where in the poem Inner Song, we see the use of a tragic metaphor where the poet says, "I am fond of your memory. It is the only room where I walk into and find you on a mulberry carpet, waiting with sealed lips." In another instance, also, we could see the use of a tragic metaphor, that is, metaphor that talks about the grief of the left behind, where the child says, where the poet says, "The house she left is held together by fear. It clatters into a darkness that sieves through till it grows a hand to strangle him." So it talks about the overwhelming pain. In the analysis, I explained that based on the fact that the poet has given us a background that the child's death happened just very recently, it simply means he's still healing, and you could still see how his metaphor talks about how deep the grief still is. But with time, he would be able to walk through. In another instance, okay, I would just like to mention the findings I discovered at the course of my analysis. I mentioned that the use of you could see the use of multiple points of view in the poem. Now, it is the poet who is the father of the child. He through the poet, we could see the different point of view. That is the point of view of the mother, the point of view of the son, the point of view of even the dead child. We could see how they talk about each of their experiences, and we could see how they talk about each of their experiences, how the death of the child has affected them personally, and even the child who is dead. We could see her speaking directly. Also, another finding which I discovered in the course of analysis is that the use of metaphors through the personalization of the dead provide consolation to the bereaved. Also, metaphors as used in the poem provide a means through which the poet reflects the memories of the left behind and the future expectation, how he hopes to outlive his grief. This study concludes that eustatic metaphor creates a medium through which the suffering of the left behind is expressed, their pains and suffering, and how they navigate their ways around their predicament. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sadiq, for especially keeping to the time. That's very good of you, as you left us a minute. Last paper for this part of the session is by Kenata Hammond Perry, titled "The Prayers of David Oluwale, Mourning Black Life from an Archive of Black Death." Do we have David there? Sorry, Kenata.
I don't think I should sing.
All right. In the situation of their absence, we move on to the Q&A session, which is where we also have the opportunity of not just to seek clarifications on some of the papers, but to make suggestions in view of each author's hope that they get feedback that would help them improve their work. And that's especially important since we are working towards platforming some of these presentations. So the floor is open. You could just, if you are in, could inform one of the technical officer there, so they alert us. Just raise your hand.
Okay.
Okay. Sustenance, you can have your question, your contribution.
All right. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, this I understand how almost unfair it could be to expect that you just use 10 minutes to give us the gist of your research, the main ideas and all that. So some of the questions may be a part of what you've already addressed in the larger paper, like in the full paper. But then maybe it's something you could possibly elaborate on or just take it into consideration as you work on your paper. So the first comment or question I have, yeah, that's for Doris. And I know you didn't have much time to dwell on your analysis because I was going to ask how does your theoretical position speak to the primary test? Like we had wanted to see some instances like illustration from the test you selected, which unfortunately we are going to start before you run out of time. So why I still hope maybe to hear more illustration from you, I would also want to know how you were thinking about the aesthetics of grieving, because I think that is a key concept in your work. And even from the title, you also referenced that a couple of times. I don't think there was any definition of the concept, or at least letting your audience know about your understanding. In what way are you using the aesthetics of grieving? What constitutes this aesthetics of grieving? So maybe it's something you could possibly flesh out or take it into account as you develop further your paper. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, Doris, you can respond to the request on how aesthetics of grieving works in your view of the primary text.
Oh, thank you. The concept of aesthetic grieving in the context of this paper deals with human expression of disruptive mind and toxic experiences contingent on tragic loss of being and other categories of existential acts. Why this is our concept, it's because grieving, there are certain existential categories of grieving, but each has different layers. Then how it connects to the text is that the heroine of Maria Mabaso Longeletta, she grieves at the loss of her husband, but not more of the human dismemberment of the lost object, that is Moldova, who is her husband, than to other cultural traits that lay heavy on her mind. What constitutes the aesthetic grieving is her ability to recall the shared values she Islamic religion that guarantees second wife. So narrating the tale to her friend Aisatu brings about new life, because when subsequent she used the past experience to construct a new identity that guarantees her authentic existence. Thank
Also,
I'm
I
can say
don't
another
know
something.
whether it
Okay, I
addressed
had
the
yeah, yes, just a minute. Yeah, I was wondering because like in so long a letter, for instance, talking about this status and why it may also be necessary scope is that there was some kind of elaborate rituals of mourning, for instance, in so long a letter, where the protagonist Ramatulai, right, like perform them despite being of
yes.
the vanguard generation, like those give someone, like people may see it as a status of grieving, like having to do this, apply this, just following, going through the rituals of money, like applying you are looking at it. You're also considering how man subject in authentic into some kind of authentic existence, confront them with some sort of a new understanding of their being or their design. So if you are thinking of it in that way, like focusing on the language memory of the husband and some other aspect, there may be a need to, like demonstrate what you are looking at. Because I know when you talk of a status, we tend to have that sort of beauty notion, the some other ingredients of beauty associated with appeal, you know. So, but of course, aesthetics is very broad. So, and if you are looking at it from this particular dimension, taking a stand as different from what comes to mind when a status is mentioned, I think it may enrich your research. Because if you mention a status, for instance, in that uh, so long a letter, what comes to mind is that sort of elaborate ritual of mourning, going through all of these things and changing your looks because you are mourning, and it gives some sort of appeal, right? So, but your position doesn't seem to be this, or if it is it or part of it, there is a need for you to, have a better clarification of what you focus on when you talk of a status of grieving. I don't know if that helps. Mm.
Sister, does that help?
Okay. Yeah. Can I ask question?
So,
Yes, please. Yes, please. Please go ahead, sister.
Okay.
Uh,
The paper is still on the process, and I feel the essence of presentation is to have it right. But then the truth emerges that my interest is not doing what is existing already, because when I read the idea of grieving right from Aristotle, Plato down to Heidegger, I felt a new idea about grieving, idea of dying and mourning. And that's why I don't want to go, even though the ritual processes like Ita in Bas later, they are all aspects of beauty. But beyond this, there is something that elicits the watery elements in the eye. And that's, it draws my attention. What is it that elicits that watery elements in the eye, which we call grieving? It is not just physical. It is something that we cannot just touch, but we can feel it. So I wouldn't know whether it would be better to go the other way, but the truth meant that my original idea would be to think about grieving from the point of view of pleasurable acts, acts of remembering, acts of fear and care, and acts of solicitude. Why I had to do this is because the truth, from my observance of people who are mourning, no matter the kind of death, we discover that people mourn not because of the deceased person, but more of sense of responsibility that the absence of the lost object bequeaths on them. In other words, I perceive elements of selfishness. So that's why I wanted to talk at grieving the way it is. So I wouldn't know what should be the ideal to have in this work. Please, I need to be
Sorry to say, there is nobody is discrediting the position you are taking. It is a very valid
okay.
position. So the only thing is that a word, that word in status, for instance, already has a history of usage. It already has
Okay.
definitions like meaning ascribed to it. So if you are departing from existing use, if you are bringing something new, there is a need to clarify your stand. Nobody
Okay.
is saying that your approach is not a valid approach. In fact, it's something that
Okay.
enriches the understanding of aesthetics, and that's new insight you are bringing to it. That's what you need to clarify, so that a reader, for instance,
Okay.
looking at your title, doesn't expect to see what
The
is already
normal.
known. Yeah, exactly. So you need to clarify as in, sort of have a clear point of departure, from the already existing notion of aesthetics, and you are good to go. So your approach is very
Thank you.
valid. Mm.
Okay, thank you, sir.
So just to add to that, I think I am attracted to where you are coming from. Even though I suppose what Sosanes is trying to say is either to delimit what you are seeing aesthetics as, or to just acknowledge the common view already and how they may also have been featured in the text you're using. But this is what you want to focus on. And the idea that our reason for shedding tears is more about us than the deceased is something I like to think about. I would want to see how you eventually are able to frame that view that it is selfish to cry at the death of someone. I am looking forward to the fuller realization of that argument. And that brings me to sustenance. I was going to ask about how you see memory and reality, because you said that the person who whose subjectivity is being reconstituted as a result of grieving, particularly grieving suicide, is caught between memory and reality. And I just needed to, not that I don't see a bit of it, but I do not want to assume that I want to know if you are seeing reality and memory as opposites, where one is caught between the two. Does my question make any sense?
Yeah, to a large extent. Yeah, the test in some way tends to blur that sort of distinction between memory and reality because the the reality, or rather memory, assumes what somebody like Julia Christopher calls exorbitant intensity, such that it became a kind of reality, what is within the frame of consciousness of the protagonist. Because reading the text, actually there is a sequence which seems to be driven by an attempt to attain healing after bereavement. So, but this sequence is something that is moves in flashes of with flashes of memories, such that now you are brought to what may look like the reality of the protagonist, like a world where the husband is no more, right? Like the present, if you like. I think what tends to define reality properly here is the present, where the husband is no more.
Yeah.
Then the next moment you're already in the past, which is entirely of the memory, like the life she was living with the husband
All right,
before she's
that's
taken
that's that's
taken
that's what
by
I
the.
thought. That's what I
Okay.
thought. But I want to also know if there is a way the word fantasy helps to understand what you are calling memory. Because I'm thinking if the memory is no longer just something entertained, but something that frames a kind of reality or a certain kind of, in which case we may be moving to the domain of fantasy. Where we live is not as it is, but as it were, or as we would want, or
It
we
would.
would want it to be, as we would wish it were. But that's by the way. I know you can
I
always.
was also going to respond to what may be considered the lived memory in the text,
Okay.
and the fantastical aspect of this lived memory, like when it is being relived in the
Okay.
both consciousness and unconsciousness of the speaker. There were the lived experiences which have had coalesced into a memory, like shared memory, so which the speaker, or rather the protagonist, recollects as she mourns the husband. So, but some of this lived experience too has sort of, transformed into some sort of fantasy, so that you see some what may be considered a fanciful rethinking of the past experience.
That makes sense. You have anything else for anyone? Does anyone else have
Mhm. I don't know. Maybe this may go to Sadiq. We still have some time. Okay, Sadiq, are you there?
Yes.
Excuse me,
Okay, all right. Yeah, sure. Okay, just
please,
hold on, Sadiq.
there is something I would like to be enlightened more on in terms of the relived memory. In relived memory, has it any significance in the nowness of the mourner?
Certainly, a memory that is relived is more like being replayed, right? So, if, for instance, it is a movie, you see this sort of thing, maybe this sort of past taking place again, and somehow it's something that intensifies the dialectic between the past and present, because you'll be struggling to distinguish the person of the subject as in now and in that memory. Why? Because when a memory is relived, there is this sort of embodiment that happens, like you are invested in it, like it is more like there is a bodily investment. It's just like, for instance, you are reliving some sort of ugly memory, and you see your body reacting, responding to it. Maybe you begin to have a goosebumps and all that. If it is a memory of a trauma, for instance, you see a similar sort of event or reactions from you repeating themselves as you are reliving the memory. So it is something that tends to collapse a temporal
Traumatic memory.
distance. Yes, it tends to
Okay.
collapse that temporal gap, because you are
Okay.
both now in the present and also in the past. So, and
Okay.
somehow
Thank
there is
you.
this sort of dialectics between the you now and the you of the past, because you are neither
Okay.
now
Okay.
nor there. Yes, because your body can
Yeah.
respond to a memory, to an event, or to a stimulus that doesn't have maybe some kind of physical
Material
presence before you.
presence.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Welcome. Yeah. But Sadiq, are you there? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much for this presentation. I think when I heard Stagia, it's something that I felt personally attracted to, because I don't think I've heard the word before. So, and it's something that seems to give foundation to your study. And looking at the way you describe it, as like those that are left, like the mourners, people that are bereaved, how Estagia seems to capture their experience, and maybe by extension, estagic metaphor also had the sort of experience or expressions they use to mourn their loss, kind of. So I was wondering if there are ways these estagic metaphors could foster coping with grief, like by investing one's grief in metaphors. Does it help one, manage their grief, like deal with the harsh reality, sort of? I don't like. I feel that grief expression is a way we try to cope with the event of bereavement, mourning, and it's more like when you are even shedding tears or you're crying, like it is more like you are being healed. In other words, you are coping with your loss. So I was wondering if there are ways these metaphors could help the bereaved, cope with the event of loss.
Yeah, I mentioned that
Oh,
there are
really?
can you hear me?
Yeah, sure, I can.
Yeah, I mentioned that there are different in the poems. There are different point of you find different point of view. That is multiple point of views in the poem. Now it is the poem was written by Sadiq Zukogi, who is the father of the late child. But we could see the experiences of not just the poets now, but the poet speaking on behalf of the father, the mother, who is also the left behind, speaking on behalf of the son, who is also the left behind, and speaking on behalf of the extended family, who are also part of those who are left behind. One of my findings from the study indicates that there are instances where the poets speak as though it is the child that is speaking directly. In those cases now, he used his metaphors to the child uses metaphor to console the father and other people who are left behind. I feel that is a kind of coping mechanism for the father, and yeah, that is a coping mechanism for the father that is indirectly consoling himself, not other people consoling him, but indirectly consoles himself through metaphors. That is where you have the child who is dead, who should ordinarily be disconnected from the family. The child now speaks in some of the poems in the collection, and she's not just speaking. She's not just using metaphors for their own sake, but she uses those metaphors to let them know that they are not responsible for her own predicament. They are not responsible for what has happened to them, and she could also feel their pain wherever she is. Wherever she is, wherever she could feel their pain. I think that is a kind of coping strategy for the poet, that is indirectly consoling himself through the use of metaphors. And I've mentioned that.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the elaboration. I was just thinking, whether, metaphor doesn't reflect some kind of emotional intensity that highlights, also the intensity of grief. Because I don't know, I know people grieve differently, and sometimes when somebody in ordinary cases, when the language that issues from a mourner is imbued with some kind of emotion, it intends to, highlight that kind of intensity of feelings, that which is to say that the mourner is deeply attached to the event of loss, sort of. But there is also the way a mourner expresses themselves. It is more like you are reliving pent up feelings. I don't know. These seem to be two different phenomena. Like when I maybe out of crying, you are relieving yourself from the event of loss. You are, in other words, getting a bit detached or withdrawn from your attachment to the lost object. So, but in other cases too, some sort of expression, that we come up with uh, when there is bereavement could connote intense attachment to the lost subject. So in the case of metaphor, and that was why I was asking, which seems to, highlight that kind of emotive investment of the mourner with the lost subject. So I was wondering if, on the other hand, it doesn't show like some, instead of facilitating coping, whether it doesn't show some, some inability to let go of the loss. I don't know. I was just trying to feel, have a clear understanding of things like this, but definitely they would always flow in different directions, such that while you mourn, it could be a way of relieving yourself from the attachment, but somehow the language
All
with which
right.
you mourn.
Thank you so much for that
Thank you.
elaborate comment on the presentation. I want to request that as we round off, if you are able to join us in the last part of our panel, which will start in about 26 minutes from now. It should be 11 a.m. Nigerian time. And thank you guys for being part of this session. It's been an interesting one. And like we said earlier in our CFP, we are already working on getting a journal where we can publish the proceedings of this panel as a special issue. So we encourage us to keep working on our papers, because we may soon call for the submission of the full papers. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.